Hi guys. Tonight, I want to tell you a story that drifts like candlelight over a long wooden table. A story about a forgotten corner of the medieval world, where the air was always touched with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. It begins in a small border village in the year 1364, a place neither fully claimed by one kingdom nor the other, where the hills rolled gently toward misty horizons, and where the people lived quietly, until the silence was broken by events that would change their lives in ways they could never imagine. This is the story of a boy named Anselm, the blacksmith's son, and the chain of small moments that would lead him far beyond the boundaries of his home. The village of Clywodden lay at the edge of two rivers, their waters winding like silver ribbons through the grasslands. In spring, when the snow melted from the high hills, the rivers swelled and hummed softly, bringing life to the barley fields and willow trees. The houses were low and thatched, their walls of wattle and daub, patched in places by the careful hands of neighbours. In the evenings, smoke curled gently from the chimneys, and the faint notes of a fiddle could sometimes be heard from the tavern near the East Road. It was not a place marked on most maps, but it had a heartbeat of its own, a rhythm made of church bells, hammer strikes, and the murmur of the wind through reeds. Anselm was 15 that year, his hands already hardened by work at his father's forge. His father, Edric, was a broad-shouldered man who rarely smiled, but whose eyes softened when he spoke of iron as though it were something alive, a creature that could be coaxed into any shape if treated with patience. Their forge stood at the very centre of the village, near the well, so Anselm often saw everyone passing by. Farmers with mud-streaked boots, women carrying baskets of bread or fish, children trailing behind with sticks in their hands. He liked that the forge was a place where stories paused for a moment, where people stopped to warm their hands or pass on a rumour before moving on. It was a clear morning in late March when he first noticed the rider. She came from the western road, her cloak the deep green of pine needles, her hood drawn low over her face. Her horse was small but sturdy, the kind used in mountain country, and the leather on its saddle bore a strange crest, two crossed branches within a circle. Anselm had never seen that symbol before. She slowed as she passed the forge, glancing toward him with an expression that was neither curiosity nor indifference, but something unreadable, as if weighing him against some hidden measure. And then she was gone, continuing toward the bridge that led deeper into the eastern valley. That night, as he lay on his straw mattress in the loft above the forge, he could still see the way she had looked at him. It was not often strangers came through Clywodden, especially alone. The road west led to rough country, and tales told by the hearth spoke of bandits, wolves, and worse things. Yet she had ridden with a quiet certainty, as though nothing on the road could touch her. 2 days later, she returned. This time she did not pass by. She stopped at the forge, dismounted, and pulled back her hood. Her hair was the colour of oak bark in rain, her skin pale as milk, but her eyes, a green so deep it seemed to hold the forest itself, were fixed on Edric. She spoke with an accent that softened her words in ways unfamiliar to Anselm. She needed a new shoe for her horse, she said, and perhaps some repairs to the stirrup iron. Edric agreed, setting to work without asking where she had come from or where she was going. That was his way. But Anselm watched her carefully, noting the small pouch she kept at her belt and the faint scar that curved from her temple to the edge of her jaw. While Edric hammered, she stood quietly, but her gaze travelled often to Anselm. Not in a way that made him uncomfortable, more like she was searching for something in him. He felt a strange weight under that gaze, as though she knew something about him that he did not yet know himself. By the time the shoe was fitted and the stirrup mended, the shadows had grown long and gold. She thanked Edric, but when she mounted her horse, she leaned slightly toward Anselm and said, in a voice just loud enough for him to hear, "The river speaks at night if you listen." He opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but she had already urged her horse forward, vanishing into the dusk. That evening, he sat by the riverside long after the moon had risen. The water whispered over stones, carrying the faint rustle of reeds. It sounded like nothing more than water to him, but he stayed until the stars were bright, half hoping, half fearing that he might hear words in the murmur. When he finally returned to the forge, his father was asleep, the coals banked low. He lay awake for hours, her words circling in his mind. The following days passed quietly, but the memory of her lingered. He asked a few of the older villagers if they had seen her before, but none knew her. A few shook their heads and muttered that strangers from the west rarely brought good fortune. One old man, leaning on his cane, told him there were ruins deep in the pine forests beyond the hills, places where the air never warmed, and the stones were etched with marks older than the kingdoms, but no one had been there in a generation. Then, one evening, a small bundle arrived at the forge, left at the threshold with no knock or word. Inside, wrapped in plain cloth, was a dagger, its hilt bound in dark leather, its blade etched with the same circle and branches symbol as the rider's saddle. Beneath it lay a scrap of parchment, the ink faded but still legible. The water remembers. Anselm held it for a long time before showing his father. Edric examined the dagger with a frown, tested its balance, and finally set it on the workbench. "Keep it hidden," he said simply, "and forget it was ever here." But Anselm knew he would not forget. He had the uneasy sense that, whatever road the rider had travelled, it had already reached out to touch him, and that the quiet life of Clywarden was about to change in ways neither he nor his father could stop. That night the wind shifted, coming down from the high hills with a sharper edge, carrying the scent of rain and pine resin. Anselm woke before dawn to the sound of the forge door creaking against its latch. He crept down the wooden ladder into the dim light, half expecting to see his father already at work, but the forge was empty. The coals still slept in their bed of ash, and the dagger sat where it had been left, its leather-bound hilt catching what little light came from the moon through the small window. The silence pressed against him. Outside, the village was still, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the faint cry of a night bird over the marsh. He stepped out into the cool air, bare feet sinking slightly into the damp earth. Somewhere beyond the black shapes of the houses, the river was whispering again, a steady hush and murmur that seemed louder than it had before, as if the night itself was urging him to come closer. He found his father by the well, speaking in a low voice to a man Anselm did not recognize. The stranger wore a hood and kept his head bent, but even from the shadows Anselm could tell he was no villager. His boots were caked with clay from a different soil, darker, redder than the earth around Clywarden, and his cloak was fastened with a brooch in the shape of a raven. They spoke in hushed tones, pausing once when the wind rose, as if listening for something far away. Edric turned sharply when he noticed Anselm watching. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried the weight of finality. "Go back inside," he said. The stranger never raised his head, never looked at Anselm, but a faint nod passed between him and Edric before Anselm obeyed. By morning, the stranger was gone. Edric acted as though nothing unusual had happened, working at the anvil with more force than was necessary. When Anselm asked who the man was, his father only said, "Someone who doesn't belong here any more than that dagger does." And then, softer, "Forget it." But Anselm could not forget. That day he carried the memory of the man's hooded shape, the raven brooch, and the low murmur of voices by the well. He also noticed something else, small changes in the village. The baker's wife hung a strip of dried herbs over her door that had not been there before. The shepherd by the eastern fields kept glancing toward the hills as he worked, his eyes squinting as if he expected to see figures on the ridgeline. Even the children played quieter games, avoiding the bridge at the edge of the village. 3 days later, the rider returned. This time she came at dusk, when the sky was heavy with the weight of approaching rain. The first drops had already begun to patter on the thatch when she dismounted at the forge. Her green cloak was wet at the edges, her hair darkened by moisture, and her expression was more severe than before. She asked for no work to be done, only if she might rest her horse under the lean-to for the night. Edric hesitated, glancing toward Anselm. Something unspoken passed between the two adults, a tension that was almost physical. Finally, Edric agreed, but said she must leave at first light. While his father prepared the small meal they would share, Anselm found himself drawn to her again. She spoke little, but her eyes often wandered toward the dagger, which now hung from a peg above the workbench. When she noticed him watching her gaze, she smiled faintly, though it was a tired smile, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. After the meal, she sat near the forge, staring into the banked coals. The rain deepened outside, drumming on the roof, filling the air with the smell of wet earth. Without looking at him, she said, "The river was high last night. Did you hear it?" Anselm nodded, though he had not gone to the water's edge. "I heard it from my bed." Her eyes flicked to his, bright and sharp even in the dim light. "It carries more than water. If you know how to listen, it carries memory. But memory can be dangerous, boy. Some things are better left at rest." Edric's voice cut through the air before Anselm could speak. "Enough of that." He stood, his jaw tight, and began clearing the bowls from the table. The rider rose without argument, but as she passed Anselm, her hand brushed his briefly, and he felt something small and cold pressed into his palm. It was not until he was alone in the loft that he opened his hand. Resting there was a flat stone, no larger than a coin, carved with the same circle and branches symbol. The grooves were deep, worn smooth by age, and it felt heavier than its size should allow. That night he dreamed of the river, its surface black beneath a starless sky, its current pulling him along without resistance. Voices moved in the water, too many to count, each one whispering fragments of words he could not quite understand. At one point he thought he saw shapes beneath the surface, tall and pale, moving against the current. When he woke, the sound of rain was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the still air. By dawn, the rider was gone again. Her horse's tracks led east, toward the bridge, but they vanished only a short distance from the village, as though the rain had washed them away, or as though she had taken a road no one else could see. Anselm kept the stone hidden in the small wooden box where he stored his few personal things, but already he sensed that hiding it would do little. Whatever had begun with the rider's first passing was not finished, and the river seemed to murmur louder with each passing night. The days that followed felt strangely stretched, as though time itself had slowed to watch what might happen next. The sky hung low with unbroken clouds, turning the mornings pale and the evenings dim before the sun had even touched the horizon. Clewarden went about its business, but Anselm could sense a shift beneath the surface of daily life. The smithing orders were fewer, though no one could say why. The chatter at the well grew shorter, the laughter more forced. People had begun glancing over their shoulders as if expecting to see someone just behind them. Anselm worked alongside his father, but his thoughts drifted constantly to the stone now hidden away in his wooden box. At night he would take it out and trace the grooves of the circle and branches, carving with his fingertip, wondering how many hands had held it before him and why it felt almost warm despite the chill in the loft. More than once, he thought he heard the faint rush of water when he touched it, even when no rain fell and the river lay quiet in the darkness. One afternoon, as he was stoking the forge fire, the door opened to admit Elder Garrett, the oldest man in Clewarden. His back was bent like the bow of a longboat, and his eyes were sharp despite the years. He rarely left his cottage on the far edge of the village, but when he did, people listened. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, his gaze sweeping the forge, resting briefly on the peg where the dagger hung. "I hear," Garrett said slowly, "that a rider from the west has passed through more than once this season." Edric did not look up from the anvil. "Travellers come and go." The old man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Not with that mark." His finger pointed toward the dagger's hilt. "That crest hasn't been seen here since before your father's father was born." Anselm felt his pulse quicken. "What does it mean?" he asked, but Edric's sharp glance silenced him. Garrett's eyes shifted to the boy. "It means old things stirring, things better left buried beneath river silt and pine roots." He turned back to Edric. "If she returns, send her on without shelter. No good comes of the branch circle." Without waiting for a reply, the old man left, his steps slow but steady, the sound of the forge door closing behind him lingering longer than it should have. That night, Anselm lay awake, his mind replaying the words, the branch circle. He had never heard the name before, yet it seemed to carry weight, like a stone dropped into deep water. He thought again of the voices in his dream, of the shapes beneath the river's surface. The unease in his chest felt heavier than curiosity now. The next morning brought frost, a thin silver skin over the grass and rooftops. As Anselm stepped outside to fetch water from the well, he saw footprints in the frost. Bare feet, small, too small for a grown man. They led from the direction of the river to the edge of the forge, where they stopped as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. He followed the trail back toward the riverbank, the ground crunching faintly under his steps. The prints were sharp and clear until they reached the damp soil near the water, and there they seemed to dissolve, not into the river itself, but into the shadows between the reeds. He stood for a while, staring at the slow current, until the cold began to bite through his boots. That evening, as the last of the light faded, he saw a flicker of movement at the far side of the river. A figure stood there, motionless among the trees. It was too far to see a face, but the shape was slight, perhaps a child, draped in something pale that shifted gently in the wind. When Anselm blinked, the figure was gone. He did not tell his father. Instead, he returned to the loft and took out the stone again. The moment it touched his palm, the sound of the river seemed to swell, though he was inside with the shutters drawn. And beneath that sound, just for a heartbeat, he thought he heard a voice speak his name. 3 nights later, the rider returned. It was late, the forge dark, when the knock came at the door. Edric opened it to find her standing there, her cloak damp with mist. She stepped inside without waiting for permission, her eyes sharp, scanning the shadows of the room. She spoke quickly, her voice low. "They've crossed the river." Edric's face hardened. "How many?" "Enough," she said. Then her gaze found Anselm. "You've kept the stone?" Anselm nodded, the air in the room suddenly feeling heavy, as though it carried the weight of what he held. "Good," she said. "You'll need it before long." Before he could ask what she meant, a sound rolled in from the east, a deep, distant horn, its note low and mournful, echoing across the water. Edric moved to the door, his hand gripping the frame, but the rider caught his arm. "It's not them you should fear tonight," she whispered. And somewhere beyond the dark, the river's voice rose, louder than Anselm had ever heard it, as if every drop of water was trying to speak at once. The horn's echo lingered in the air like the last shiver of a struck bell, fading into the thick night. Outside, the mist clung to the village, wrapping the rooftops and narrow paths in a pale veil. The sound of the river was no longer the soft, familiar murmur Anselm had known all his life. It churned now, restless, as if stirred by some hidden current beneath its surface. The rider moved first. She crossed the room to where the dagger hung and took it down without asking. The steel caught the dim firelight, and the carved crest seemed sharper than before, the branches almost alive in the glow. She turned it in her hand as though weighing it, then slid it into her belt. "We have little time," she said, her voice steady but edged with urgency. Edric stepped in her path. "If you mean to drag him into whatever this is, you'll answer to me." Her eyes met his, calm but unyielding. "It's already found him. The stone chose its holder. You know what that means." Anselm stood in the shadows, the carved stone suddenly heavy in his pocket. He didn't understand their words, yet he knew they were speaking of him, as though he had stepped into the current of something far larger than himself. A faint sound drifted through the open door, soft, rhythmic, almost like the splash of bare feet moving quickly through shallow water. It came from the direction of the river, and it was getting closer. The rider's hand went to the dagger. "Inside," she ordered, gesturing toward the loft. But Edric shook his head. "No, if they've crossed, the loft won't save him." Before Anselm could speak, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was small, no taller than Anselm's shoulder, and at first he thought it might be a child. But as the mist curled away from it, he saw its skin was pale in the way of river stones, almost translucent, and its hair clung to its head as though still wet. Its eyes were dark and depthless, reflecting the forge fire without warmth. The rider stepped forward. "You have no place here," she said, her voice low, almost a growl. The figure tilted its head slightly, like a bird listening for something far away. When it spoke, the voice was high but without age, each word sliding into the next. "The river remembers. The stone has awakened. It must be returned." Anselm felt the carved token in his pocket grow warmer, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to tilt. the air thick with the smell of rain and silt. He gripped it tightly, half afraid it would leap from his hand on its own. "You'll not take it," the rider said, placing herself between Anselm and the figure. A sound like a sigh passed through the room, though no one had moved. Then the figure stepped back into the mist. More shapes appeared behind it, slender forms, silent, their outlines blurring as if they were part of the fog itself. They did not advance, only watched, their presence heavier than any movement could have been. The horn sounded again, farther away this time, and the figures dissolved into the night. The rider turned immediately to Edric. "They will try again. You know they will not stop now." Edric's jaw tightened. "Then we go before dawn." Anselm finally found his voice. "Go where?" The rider's gaze softened just slightly as it fell on him. "Upstream, where the river's first waters rise. That is where this began, and where it must end." The hours until dawn were restless. Edric packed in silence, bread, a skin of water, a small hammer wrapped in cloth. The rider sat by the fire, sharpening the dagger until its edge gleamed. Anselm lay in the loft, but sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pale figures standing in the mist, waiting. When the first grey light touched the sky, they set out. The village still slept as they crossed the empty square. The air was cold and still, carrying only the faint smell of wet reeds. Anselm glanced once toward the river and saw no movement, no ripple, but the sense of being watched never left him. The rider led the way east, her pace brisk but sure, as if she knew every bend in the land. Edric followed close behind, glancing often at the tree line. Anselm walked last, his fingers curled around the stone in his pocket, its warmth steady against his skin. They passed the bridge and the last of the barley fields, and the land began to rise. The mist thinned, replaced by the shadow of tall pines whose trunks stood like silent sentinels. Somewhere far off, water was moving, faster now, not the slow murmur of the village river, but the stronger rush of its upper course. The rider slowed only when they reached a narrow clearing where the ground dipped into a shallow hollow. At its centre stood an ancient stone marker, its surface worn but still bearing a faint carving, the same circle and branches symbol as the dagger, the stone, and the saddle she had ridden in on. Anselm stepped closer, his breath catching. The moment his shadow touched the marker, the stone in his pocket pulsed once, like the beat of a heart. The pulse of the stone was brief, but it left a strange ache in Anselm's hand, as though it had drawn something from him. He stood before the weathered marker, its surface mottled with lichen, the carved symbol almost swallowed by the passing of centuries. The air here felt different, still, but not in the way of peace. It was the stillness of a held breath of something waiting. The rider stepped up beside him. "This is one of the old places," she said quietly. "Older than the villages, older than the kingdoms. The river begins in the hills beyond, but this is where the water remembers best." Edric scanned the tree line, his grip tightening on the small hammer he carried. "We shouldn't linger." Ignoring him, the rider crouched by the base of the marker and brushed away the damp moss. Beneath it lay a series of smaller carvings, lines, arcs, and tiny notches that seemed to run like veins through the stone. "They'll follow us here," she said, her voice matter of fact. "The stone you carry calls to them, but it also binds them if we use it right." Anselm swallowed, glancing toward the shadowed pines. The forest seemed to press closer the longer they stood there, and the sound of running water had grown louder, though no stream was in sight. "What are they?" he asked at last. The rider did not look at him. "They are what's left when memory has more weight than flesh. The river keeps such things." Edric stepped forward. "And you mean to put my son between them and whatever's up there in the hills?" The rider rose to her feet, meeting his gaze. "If he leaves the stone behind, they'll take it. And when they do, they'll take him with it. You know that as well as I do." Edric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The rider's eyes returned to Anselm. "We go upstream from here. There is a ford where the water runs over black stone, and beyond it, a place the river hasn't touched in an age. That's where we can finish this." They moved on, following a narrow path that wound between moss-covered boulders and the roots of old trees. The sound of the water grew sharper, carrying a low, almost metallic undertone, as if it was running over something hidden beneath. When they reached the ford, the water was clear and fast, spilling over wide stones slick with dark moss. The rider stepped in without hesitation, the current swirling around her boots. Anselm followed, the cold biting through the leather, making his ankles ache. Edric came last, his gaze flicking often to the forest on either side. On the far bank, the land rose sharply, the path narrowing into a rocky ledge above the stream. Here the pines thinned, replaced by stunted oaks twisted by wind and time. The air was cooler, the light dim despite the morning hour. Halfway up the rise, the rider stopped so suddenly that Anselm nearly walked into her. She raised a hand for silence. At first he heard nothing but the water below, but then it came, faint and uneven. The sound of feet on wet stone, too light to be human steps, keeping pace with them. Edric turned, but the path behind was empty. Still, the noise persisted, always just beyond the edge of sight. "They're not following on the ground," the rider murmured. "They're following in the water." Anselm's hand went instinctively to the stone in his pocket. The warmth had returned, spreading slowly up his arm. It was not unpleasant, but it made him uneasy, as if the stone was aware of the presence behind them. By midday, the path opened into a plateau of bare rock, dotted with patches of pale grass. At its centre stood a circle of standing stones, weathered and leaning, their surfaces carved with the same ancient crest. Inside the ring, the ground dipped into a shallow basin, its floor covered in black silt. No water flowed here, yet the air carried the scent of the river. The rider stepped into the circle. "This was once a pool," she said, "a place where the first waters gathered before the stream was born. They say the river's memory begins here." Edric hung back at the edge of the stones. "And what do we do now?" She turned to Anselm. "The stone you carry needs to touch the earth here, but once you place it, you must not pick it up again. Do you understand?" Anselm nodded slowly, though the thought of letting it go left an odd hollow feeling in his chest. As he stepped into the basin, a movement at the far edge of the plateau caught his eye. Figures were emerging from the mist that hung low over the rock, slender, pale and silent. The same dark, depthless eyes fixed on him, unblinking. "They've found us," the rider said, drawing the dagger. "Do it now, boy." The stone in his hand pulsed again, harder this time, the warmth flaring into heat. And in the hum of that heat, he thought he heard a single word, spoken in the same voice that had whispered his name before. "Return." Anselm dropped to one knee in the centre of the basin, the carved stone burning in his palm. The pale figures glided closer, their feet never seeming to truly touch the rock, their movements as fluid as the river itself. The rider stood between him and them, dagger poised, her stance low and ready. Edric moved to her side, hammer in hand, though his eyes never left his son. The heat from the token grew unbearable. It was no longer just in his hand, it throbbed up his arm, into his chest, as though his heartbeat had merged with the rhythm inside the stone. His breath came in shallow pulls. The basin seemed to tilt around him, the standing stones leaning in as if they, too, were waiting. The whisper returned. This time it was not faint, but insistent, layered with many voices speaking as one. "Return it to where it began." Anselm pressed the token to the black silt. The instant it touched the ground, the heat drained from it in a rush, and a deep vibration rolled outward through the earth. The silt darkened further, shifting like liquid. A thread of water welled up beneath the token, clear at first, then clouded with silt, spiralling in slow circles around it. The pale figures stopped at the edge of the circle, their forms wavering, as though the air around them had thickened. The rider's voice was low but firm. "Hold it there. Don't move your hand until it takes." The water rose, curling upward to wrap around the stone. It seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, its surface breaking into ripples though no wind touched it. Anselm felt the pull in his arm, stronger now, as if the stone were drawing something out of him. For a moment he thought he saw shapes inside the water, faces half-formed, eyes open and unblinking, lips moving in silent words. Edric shifted, his stance tense. "It's taking too long," he muttered. The rider didn't look away from the figures at the edge. "It will take as long as it must." One of the pale forms stepped forward, its head tilting in that same bird-like way. When it spoke, the sound was like water poured onto stone. "It does not belong to you." The rider answered without turning her head. "It doesn't belong to you either." The figure's mouth did not move, but the voice came again, colder now. He carries it in his blood. Anselm's skin prickled at the words, though he didn't understand them. The pull on his arm suddenly increased, and the water flared bright for an instant, the light casting long warped shadows of the standing stones. Then, just as quickly, it dimmed again. The rider's tone sharpened. "Now, Anselm, let it go." He released the stone. It sank into the silt without a sound, the water following it down until the basin was still again. The figures at the edge seemed to waver, their shapes thinning, fading into the mist. One by one they turned away, vanishing into the grey until only the wind moved through the stones. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavier than before, but the sense of being watched had eased. Edric stepped forward, helping his son to his feet. "It's done?" The rider sheathed the dagger. "For now." Her eyes lingered on the basin, but the river never forgets completely. They left the plateau in silence, retracing their steps to the ford. The water there ran faster than before, its surface broken by white foam where it struck the black stones. The sound seemed louder, almost as if the river was speaking to itself. By the time they reached the edge of the pines, the mist had thinned, and the faint outline of the village could be seen far off across the valley. Anselm glanced back only once, toward the high ground where the standing stones lay hidden. The plateau was empty, but he thought he saw a shimmer above it, like sunlight on water, even though the sky was grey. That night, they returned to the forge. Edric banked the fire, and the rider sat for a long time without speaking, her gaze fixed on the closed shutters, as though expecting something beyond them. Anselm tried to sleep in the loft, but the image of the water spiralling around the stone stayed with him. Sometime after midnight, he woke to the sound of dripping. At first, he thought it was rain, but when he sat up, he saw a line of wet footprints leading from the door to the base of the ladder. They were small, too small for any villager, and glistened faintly in the dim light. He leaned over the edge, but the room below was empty. Only the quiet breath of the banked coals filled the space. Yet he knew, with the same certainty as the pull of the stone before, that something had stood at the bottom of the ladder, watching him in the dark. The footprints were still there in the morning, pale outlines against the dark, dry boards, though the dampness had long since vanished. Edric said nothing when he saw them, only frowned and tightened the latch on the forge door before setting to work. The rider, however, examined them closely, crouching until her eyes were level with the marks. "They didn't come from outside," she murmured. "The first print is here, not on the threshold. They were already in the room." Anselm felt the weight of her words settle into his stomach. He remembered the stillness in the loft, the sense of being watched. "If the stone is gone, why are they still here?" he asked. The rider's eyes flicked to him, then to Edric. "Because the river remembers more than objects. It remembers those who carry its marks." Edric straightened from the anvil. "Enough. He's had enough of your riddles." "They aren't riddles," she said, her voice sharper now. "You've seen it yourself, Edric. It's not the token they want anymore. It's him." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Anselm's mind spun with questions he couldn't put into shape. The rest of the day passed in a strained quiet. Customers came and went, but Edric spoke little, and the rider kept to the far corner of the forge, sharpening tools that didn't truly need sharpening. Anselm worked the bellows, his eyes drifting often to the doorway. The village seemed too quiet for a day without rain. No laughter came from the square, no voices from the well. Even the dogs lay with their heads down, watching the road. Near dusk, Elder Garrett appeared again, leaning heavily on his cane. His gaze swept the forge, settling at last on Anselm. "The mist came early today," he said slowly. "It rolled down from the hills before the sun began to fall." The rider stood. "Then it's starting again." Edric's hands stilled on the hammer. "We ended it." Garrett shook his head. "You cannot end a thing that began before you were born." As if to answer him, a faint sound drifted through the open doorway, the same soft, uneven splashing Anselm had heard the night the pale figure first appeared. It was close now, moving through the narrow spaces between the houses. The rider's hand went to the dagger at her belt. "They shouldn't be able to cross without the stone," she whispered. Garrett's gaze moved from her to Anselm. "Unless the stone never truly left him." The splashing grew louder, joined by another sound. A low, steady hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was not the voice of the river, but it carried the same depth, the same weight. Anselm felt it in his bones before he heard it in his ears. Without warning, the latch on the forge door shuddered. Edric moved to bar it, but before he could, the wood swelled and groaned, as though pressed from the other side by something far heavier than hands. The rider stepped forward, drawing the dagger, her stance angled toward the door. The pressure ceased suddenly, replaced by silence. No splash, no hum, just the faint hiss of the cooling forge. Then came a voice, low and clear, from just beyond the door. Anselm. It was not a shout or a call, but the way it shaped his name made the hair at his neck rise. It was the same voice he had heard in the basin, layered and many-tongued. The rider glanced at him sharply. Don't answer. But he found himself stepping toward the sound before he realized he'd moved. His feet carried him to the threshold, his fingers brushing the latch. The world beyond the door felt close, as though he could step into it without crossing the distance. Edric's hand closed hard around his arm, pulling him back. The rider slammed the bolt down across the door. For a moment there was nothing, and Anselm thought the presence outside might have gone. Then the voice came again, softer, almost coaxing. The river is rising. A sudden wind swept against the walls of the forge, carrying the scent of water and silt. Somewhere in the distance, though no storm had been forecast, thunder rolled low across the hills. The thunder faded into a long, trembling echo that seemed to settle deep into the wooden beams of the forge. Anselm stood rigid, his father's grip still firm on his arm, though the wind had stilled. The rider moved to the shuttered window, tilting her head as if listening to something far off. It's not just the river, she said at last. The hills are speaking too. Edric gave a short, humorless snort. Hills don't speak. They do when the water runs under them. She replied without looking back. And under these hills it's moving fast. The old boards of the floor gave a faint creak beneath Anselm's feet, though he hadn't shifted his weight. For a strange moment he felt as if something far below was shifting, like the slow turn of a wheel. The sensation passed quickly, but it left a hollow ache in his chest. Garrett, still leaning on his cane, broke the silence. The ford will be gone by morning. The rider turned sharply to him. You've seen it? He shook his head. I don't need to. The mist is climbing. It always climbs before the water takes the low ground. Outside, the village was unnaturally quiet. The wind no longer stirred, yet the air felt charged, as if just before lightning. Somewhere to the east, a faint dripping began, slow at first, then faster, until it became a steady patter. It wasn't rain. The sound was too focused, too deliberate, as though coming from a single source that was drawing closer. The rider crossed to Anselm. If they can't take you through the stone, they'll take you through the flood. You'll go where the river goes, and it will keep you. He swallowed, feeling the truth in her words without understanding why. What do I do? Stay above it, she said. Higher than the hills if you can. Edric's brow furrowed. You mean to run? To climb, she corrected. The river's path here isn't just on the surface. There are channels beneath, old ones. If they're opening, we'll be cut off unless we move now. Before Edric could answer, the dripping sound reached the threshold. A shadow slid across the narrow gap under the door, followed by another, as if a pool of water was spreading there. But the boards stayed dry, and the smell that rose from it was sharp. Cold stone and something metallic, almost like blood. Then came the whisper. It seeped through the walls and shutters, not from one direction but from all sides at once, so that Anselm couldn't tell if it was inside his head or around him. The river remembers. The river keeps. The rider drew the dagger and pointed it toward the door. We move, now. Edric hesitated only a moment before grabbing his pack and thrusting it at Anselm. Take it, and don't let go of my hand once we're outside. They slipped out through the back, avoiding the square. The air was damp, the mist thick enough to hide the outlines of the houses until they were almost upon them. The streets were empty, but in the stillness Anselm thought he heard faint splashes echoing in the alleys, always just behind them. The rider led them toward the old mill road, the one that wound up the slope toward the sheep pastures. It climbed quickly, the stones slick underfoot. The higher they went, the more the mist seemed to swirl and resist. curling into their path as if to block them. Halfway up the rise, a deep groan rolled through the earth, so low it made the air hum in Anselm's chest. Edric stopped short, staring down toward the village. From the high path, they could see it. The river had risen not in slow flood, but in a sudden swell, a dark sheet of water spilling over its banks and into the lower lanes. It moved with unnatural speed, snaking between the houses, pulling with its shadows that didn't quite match the shapes of the buildings they passed. One of those shadows lifted its head. Eyes like still pools caught the dim light, fixed on Anselm across the distance. Even from here he could feel the pull, a subtle but certain tug toward the rising water. The rider's voice cut through the chill. "Don't look at them. Keep climbing." But Anselm's feet felt heavier with each step, as if the path itself wanted him to turn back, to walk down into the dark water where the river waited. The pull toward the dark water was not a single force, but many, like unseen hands pressing at his shoulders, his back, his legs. Each step forward felt wrong, as if he were walking against the natural order of things, away from where he was meant to be. The rider glanced over her shoulder and must have seen it in his eyes because she quickened her pace, cutting across the slope to a narrower trail that wound between two jutting shelves of stone. Here, the mist thinned slightly, and the air felt clearer, though the sounds from below carried more sharply. The water was still rising, but it no longer moved like floodwater. It surged in deliberate waves, pooling and retreating in strange rhythms. The shapes within it moved more freely now, pale heads rising briefly above the surface before slipping under again. Edric kept a tight grip on Anselm's arm. "Don't let them see you falter," he said, not looking at him. "They follow weakness." The rider led them toward a low ridge where an ancient shepherd's hut stood, its roof sagging under the weight of moss. It was barely more than a shell of stones, but the walls were thick, and it sat high enough that even in heavy rain, water would never reach its door. She ducked inside first, scanning the corners before motioning for them to follow. The interior smelled of old lichen and dust, the air cool and still. A small hole in the roof let in a shaft of grey light that caught on a single object in the centre of the dirt floor, a flat, round stone, its surface worn smooth. The symbol of the circle and branches was carved into it, though the lines were shallower, almost erased by time. The rider froze. "I didn't know this was here." Garrett's voice came from the doorway, startling them all. "Few do. It's older than the hut, older than the road that brought you here." Anselm's chest tightened. He hadn't seen the old man follow them. Why does it have the same mark?" Garrett stepped inside slowly, leaning on his cane. "Because it is part of the same binding. The river's memory is not kept in one place. These stones mark where its current runs beneath the earth, deep enough to carry more than water." The rider crouched beside the carved stone, running her fingers lightly over the grooves. "If this one's still intact, it might hold them back." "Only if he stays with it," Garrett said, his gaze settling on Anselm. Edric stepped forward. "He's not staying here." "If you take him higher," Garrett said, "you take him away from the old paths that hold them. The higher you climb, the less the land remembers. But the less it remembers, the freer they are to take him." A silence settled over the hut, broken only by the distant, irregular rush of the water below. Then, faint but distinct, came a sound from outside, not the splash of water this time, but the steady tap of something against stone. Tap. Pause. Tap. Tap. The rider's hand went to her dagger. She moved to the doorway and peered out. After a moment she stepped back inside, her voice low. "They're here." Edric positioned himself between Anselm and the door, his shoulders tense. "How many?" "More than before." The tapping grew louder, joined by a soft rustle like reeds swaying in the wind. But no wind touched the ridge. The sound circled the hut, moving from one wall to the next, until it felt as if the stone itself might begin to shift under the pressure. Anselm's heart pounded. The carved stone in the centre of the floor was warm now, a faint hum vibrating through the ground beneath it. Without knowing why, he stepped toward it, his hand hovering above the symbol. The moment his shadow fell across it, the noise outside faltered. "They don't like that," the rider murmured. Garrett's eyes didn't leave Anselm. "Then let him keep doing it." Anselm knelt, pressing his palm to the ancient carving. The warmth spread quickly, stronger than before, and the hum deepened into a low, steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Outside, the tapping ceased entirely, replaced by a silence so sharp it rang in his ears. For a brief, trembling moment, he thought they had gone. Then a voice spoke from just beyond the wall, so close it felt as if it were breathing through the stones. "You cannot bind what is already part of you." The words slid through the stones as if the wall between them did not exist, their tone neither threat nor comfort, but something colder, a statement of fact. Anselm's hand trembled against the carved symbol, yet he did not lift it. The hum beneath his palm seemed to answer the voice, deepening until it was almost a growl in the earth. The rider stepped closer to him, her eyes fixed on the wall where the voice had come. "If you were part of him," she said, her voice low and steady, "you wouldn't need to speak." The silence that followed was thick enough to make every breath sound loud. Then came a slow scrape, like fingers dragging over stone, moving along the outside wall toward the door. Edric shifted his stance, tightening his grip on the hammer. "They're testing it," he muttered. "They'll find the weak point," Garrett added, leaning heavily on his cane. "They always do." The rider turned to Anselm. "Listen to me. If they try to draw you out, you don't move. No matter what you hear, no matter what they show you." Anselm swallowed hard. "Show me?" Her gaze didn't soften. "They can wear faces you know, they can speak in voices you trust." Almost as if the words had summoned it, the sound changed. A gentle knock came at the door, not the irregular tapping from before, but 3 slow, familiar raps. And then a voice. "Anselm? It's Myra. Let me in, love, it's cold out here." His breath caught. Myra was a girl from the village, a year younger than him, with a quick laugh and eyes like the river in spring sunlight. He had known her since they could both barely walk. The warmth in her voice was exactly as he remembered it, each note carrying the small comforts of home. Edric's jaw tightened. "That's not her." The voice came again, softer, coaxing. "Please, Anselm, I just want to talk." The carved stone beneath his hand pulsed once, and the warmth flared up his arm. His mind wavered between the memory of Myra's smile and the rider's warning. Outside, the mist thickened against the small opening in the roof, dimming the grey light. The voice at the door shifted, deepening, becoming another he knew even better, his mother's. "Anselm, open the door, my boy. I've missed you so." The ache that hit him then was sudden and sharp. He remembered her hands smelling of flour, the way she would hum while mending clothes by the fire. But she had been gone for years, taken by a fever that swept through the village one winter. He closed his eyes, pressing his palm harder against the stone, willing the hum to drown out the voice. The rider knelt beside him, placing her hand over his. The 2 hums joined, hers and his, merging into a steady, resonant thrum that filled the hut. Outside, the voice faltered, the warmth stripped from it. When it came again, it was raw and hollow. "The river rises." The ground beneath them shifted subtly, and a faint vibration ran through the walls. Garrett moved to the door, his expression grim. "They're flooding the hollow," he said. "When the water reaches the stone, it will wash the binding clean." The rider stood, glancing at the shaft of light above. "Then we go higher." Edric looked to the boy. "Can he leave it?" "For now," she said. "But they'll follow, and the higher we go, the less the land will hold them." They stepped out into a world dimmed by mist. The ridge path that had brought them here was already slick with a thin sheen of water, flowing from somewhere unseen above. The smell of the river was everywhere, damp earth, moss, and the faint metallic tang that made Anselm's teeth ache. The rider took the lead, setting a brisk pace toward the spine of the hill. Edric stayed close behind Anselm, and Garrett followed, slower but sure-footed. When they reached the crest, Anselm looked back. The hollow where the hut stood was already filling, the water too dark for the pale light, its surface shifting with slow, deliberate ripples. Just at the edge of sight, shapes moved beneath it, gliding like shadows toward where they had stood moments before. The rider's voice broke the stillness. "We'll reach the old watchtower before nightfall. If its stones still stand, it might see us through until the water drops." But Anselm knew without needing to say it, the river would not drop on its own. Not this time. The climb toward the watchtower was steeper than Anselm expected, the path narrowing to a single line of cracked stones pressed against the side of the hill. On their left, the slope dropped away into a tangle of pine and rock, where the mist gathered thickest. On their right, the land rose in jagged shelves, streaked with veins of black where rainwater had cut deep channels over the years. The rider moved with quick, deliberate steps, never once glancing behind her. Edric stayed close to Anselm's shoulder, his hand ready to grip the boy's arm if the path shifted underfoot. Garrett followed with the steadiness of someone who had walked these hills before the rest of them were born, his cane clicking softly against the stone. By midday, the air had changed. It no longer carried the damp heaviness of the village river, but a thinner, sharper scent, wind from higher ground. Yet beneath it was still that faint metallic tang, impossible to escape. Somewhere far below, hidden in the folds of the hills, the rush of water echoed upward, louder than it should have been. It was only when they rounded a bend that the watchtower came into view. It rose from the ridge like a finger of dark stone, its upper half broken away long ago, leaving jagged edges open to the sky. The base was wider, built of massive blocks weathered smooth by centuries of wind. No light shone from its hollow windows. The rider slowed as they approached, her eyes scanning the ground. "No tracks," she murmured. "That's good." Edric grunted. "Or it means they're already inside." The tower door was little more than a slab of grey wood bound by rusted iron. It gave under the rider's push, swinging inward with a groan. The air that came out was stale, touched with the faint scent of old ashes. Inside, the space was round and bare, save for a narrow staircase winding upward along the wall. The stones underfoot were cold, almost damp, though no water had seeped in. They stepped inside, and the rider shut the door behind them. The sound of the wind dulled instantly, leaving only the slow drip of water somewhere high above. "This place was built before the kingdom claimed these hills," Garrett said, his voice echoing slightly. "Its stones were laid over a spring the old ones called the Still Well. The water there doesn't move, not even in flood." Anselm felt the words settle into him in a way he couldn't explain. A well where water did not move. How could that be? Yet something in the idea felt familiar, almost comforting, like the memory of standing on solid ground after being tossed in a storm. They climbed the narrow steps to the upper chamber, where 3 tall windows opened to the valley. From here they could see the river's reach, a dark, spreading stain winding through the lowlands, its edges blurring into the mist. And there, moving with slow purpose against the current, were the pale forms, dozens now. "They're not hunting," the rider said quietly. "They're herding." Edric frowned. "Herding what?" She looked at Anselm. "Herding him." A sudden knock echoed from the base of the tower, sharp and deliberate. 1, 2, 3, the same rhythm as before. The sound carried easily up the stairwell, followed by a pause long enough for Anselm's pulse to slow, then the scrape of something against stone. The rider's hand went to the dagger. "They're testing the door." Garrett eased himself down to sit on a low stone ledge. "The still well will hold them for a time, but it's not a wall. It's a tether. If they find a way to cut it..." He didn't finish. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't at the door. It came from higher up, above them. A shiver ran through the stones as a small shower of dust fell from the broken rim of the tower. Anselm stepped toward the nearest window and looked up. At first he saw nothing but the pale strip of cloud above the jagged edges. Then something shifted there, a shape that moved with a slow, fluid grace, its limbs too long, its fingers brushing the stone as it lowered itself toward the opening. Its eyes caught his before he could step back. They were dark, but within them swirled the faint reflection of moving water, as if the river itself were watching through them. The rider's voice snapped him out of his stillness. "Away from the window, boy!" But even as he moved back, the thing was already inside, its wet hands leaving no mark on the stone. It straightened, impossibly tall in the narrow chamber, its gaze fixed only on him. And when it spoke, its voice was the sound of water flowing in reverse. "You have not given it all back." The words seemed to pull at the air itself, bending the space between Anselm and the thing that loomed before him. He felt it like a current around his chest, as if the water in his own blood was listening. His mouth was dry, yet he could almost taste the sharp tang of the river. The rider moved first. In 2 steps she was between them, dagger drawn, the steel catching the dim light from the windows. "He's given back what was taken," she said, each word deliberate. "You'll get no more." The thing tilted its head, water glistening along the curve of its jaw, though no drop fell. "Not taken," it replied in that backward-flowing voice, given to him before the first memory, before the first breath. Edric's stance shifted, placing himself to block Anselm from the other side. "If you want him, you'll have to go through us." The figure's gaze slid past them both, settling again on Anselm. Its eyes were calm, too calm, as if it already knew the outcome. "He is already in the river," it murmured. Then it moved, not with the sudden lunge of an attacker, but with the inevitable slide of water down a slope. One moment it was standing, the next its long fingers were brushing the edge of the floor as though testing the stones. The sound that followed was not the shattering of rock or wood, but a deep, slow groan from the foundation itself. Garrett's cane struck the ground once, sharp and loud. "You'll not break this tower from within. The well runs deeper than you can reach." For the first time, the figure's eyes flickered toward the old man. "The well is still," it said, and its voice rippled with something almost like contempt. "But the boy is not." The rider lunged then, her blade flashing toward the thing's side, but instead of striking flesh, the dagger passed through as though cutting into deep water, slowing until the motion itself seemed to dissolve. The figure stepped back and the blade slid free without resistance, not a drop clinging to it. "Steel will not hold it," Garrett warned. "I've noticed," she replied through clenched teeth. The thing moved toward the open stairwell, not to flee but to descend. "The river rises. You will follow." And then it was gone, its long limbs melting into the shadowed curve of the stairs. No one moved for several breaths. Then the rider sheathed her dagger with a motion that was more frustration than finality. "It's not finished with him." Anselm's voice was low. "It said I was in the river. What does that mean?" Garrett's eyes were unreadable. "It means the binding did more than hold them back. It tied something of the river into you. That's why it won't let go." Edric shook his head. "We'll find a way to cut that tie." But the old man's reply was quiet. "There are ties you can cut, and there are ties you can only follow to their end." Below, from somewhere near the tower's base, came the faint rush of water, not the slow seep of a spring, but the steady, deliberate flow of a stream where no stream should be. The rider crossed to the window and leaned out. "It's climbing the ridge," she said, her tone flat. "The flood's coming here." Anselm stepped to her side and saw it. A black ribbon of water snaking uphill, impossible and relentless, its surface crawling with pale shapes that moved against the current. "They're bringing the river to him," Garrett said. "Stone or no stone, they'll have him when it touches the tower." The rider's jaw tightened. "Then we leave before it reaches us." She turned to the stairs, but Edric caught her arm. "If we go down, we meet them on the way up." "Not if we take the high wall," she said, nodding toward the jagged remains of the tower's upper edge. "From there we can cross to the ridge path. It'll be a hard climb, but it's the only way." A loud crack split the air, a stone from the lower wall giving way. The tower shuddered underfoot. Anselm felt the vibration through the soles of his boots, as if the hill itself was trembling. They moved quickly. The rider went first, pulling herself up onto the crumbling rim, testing each stone before shifting her weight. Edric followed, then Anselm, with Garrett last, slower but steady. The wind was sharper up here, tugging at their cloaks, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of deep water. From this height, Anselm could see the valley spread below like a dark, restless sea, the village gone under a blanket of mist and black water. And winding through it all, in patterns too deliberate to be chance, the pale forms moved, always upward, always toward them. The ridge path beyond the tower's crown was narrow, no more than a ledge carved by time and wind. On one side, the hillside dropped into a sheer fall, lost in the swirl of mist below. On the other, jagged rock rose in a wall of slate and granite, streaked with thin veins of quartz that caught the dim light like threads of bone. The rider moved fast despite the height, her steps careful but certain. Edric followed close, his free hand gripping the rock face whenever the wind threatened to shove him toward the drop. Anselm came after, the cold biting into his fingers as he steadied himself on rough stone. Behind him, Garrett's cane tapped slow and steady, the old man's breath harsh in the thin air. Below, the sound of water was no longer distant. It climbed the slope in deliberate surges, like the tide pushed by an unseen hand. Each rise was followed by a stillness too perfect, too measured, before the next swell began. "Keep your eyes forward," the rider called over her shoulder, though her voice was calm. "Looking down will only slow you." Anselm tried, but his gaze strayed anyway. Between swirls of mist, he caught glimpses of the black water rising along the tower's base, the pale shapes moving within it. They didn't swim. Not exactly. They drifted, drawn upward, their heads tilting now and then as though following a sound only they could hear. They had been climbing for nearly an hour when the path ahead narrowed to almost nothing, a knife edge of stone that stretched across a gap in the ridge. The rider stepped onto it without pause, her arms slightly out for balance. Anselm's mouth went dry. "That's the only way?" "It's the fastest," she said, without looking back. Edric crossed next, his boots scraping against the stone. Anselm followed, his steps small, his eyes fixed on the rider's back. The wind here was sharper, curling up from the gorge below and tugging at his cloak. Halfway across, he made the mistake of glancing down. Far beneath, in the dark water pooled between the cliffs, something shifted. Not one of the pale, drifting shapes. This was larger, slower, its outline impossible to fix. It moved as though it were part of the river itself, not merely within it. The sight rooted him for a heartbeat too long. "Anselm," Edric's voice called, low but urgent. "Keep moving." He did, forcing himself to the far side, where the path widened again. Garrett came last, his pace deliberate, each placement of the cane tested before he shifted his weight. Beyond the crossing, the ridge sloped upward toward a line of stunted trees clinging to the rock. Their branches were twisted into strange shapes by the wind, their roots gripping cracks in the stone. The rider slowed here, scanning the ground. "There should be another marker," she murmured. Edric frowned. "Like the ones in the village?" She nodded. "If it's still here, it's old enough to hold against them for a while." They found it half buried under a tangle of roots, a flat stone no larger than a shield, its surface worn but still bearing the faint circle and branches crest. Moss grew thick along its edges, and the air above it felt subtly different, cooler and heavier. Garrett ran his fingers over the carving. "This one's weaker than the rest. It hasn't been kept." "It might be enough," the rider said, "if we can draw them here before the flood reaches this height." Anselm opened his mouth to ask how, but before he could speak, the wind shifted, the scent of water grew stronger, and with it came a faint sound, an echoing knock, 3 times from somewhere far below. "They're close," the rider said. Her eyes went to Anselm. "If they're drawn to you, then stand by the stone. Let it take what it can." Edric's face hardened. "And if it takes more than it should?" The rider didn't answer. Anselm stepped toward the marker anyway. As his shadow touched it, the hum began again, faint at first, then stronger. The stone under his boots seemed to anchor him, though the pull in his chest grew heavier. From the mist below, the pale shapes emerged, gliding up the slope as if the steepness meant nothing. Their eyes caught the thin light, and one by one their heads tilted toward him. And then the water itself began to rise up the rock face, slow, deliberate, as though climbing to meet him. The water did not crash against the rocks like a wave. It crept, curling and folding upon itself, climbing higher with a patient certainty. Its surface shimmered in the grey light, and beneath it, the pale shapes moved in unison, their limbs trailing like streamers in a current too slow for such motion. Anselm's boots felt fixed to the ground, the hum from the marker stone thrumming up his legs into his chest. It was stronger here than it had been in the shepherd's hut, as though the ridge itself was awake beneath him. The weight in his chest pulsed with it, not painful but deep, like the beat of a second heart. "They're answering," Garrett murmured, his eyes fixed on the water's slow ascent. "The stone is calling them." The rider positioned herself a few paces ahead of Anselm, dagger drawn, though she did not move to strike. Edric stayed at his son's side, one hand gripping the hammer, the other resting lightly on Anselm's shoulder, as if to anchor him in place should the pull grow too strong. The first of the pale figures reached the base of the ridge. It began to climb, its hands finding holds in the wet rock without effort. Behind it came more, dozens, their movements as smooth and soundless as the water from which they rose. None looked away from Anselm. The hum deepened. The air seemed to press inward as if the sky itself had lowered. The twisted trees shivered, though no wind touched them. Anselm's breath quickened, each inhale tasting faintly of silt. The shapes below were closer now, their eyes dark and depthless, their faces smooth save for the faint ripple of something moving just beneath the skin. "They'll reach us in moments," Edric said under his breath. The rider's voice was calm but taut. "Not if the stone holds." Then the first of them touched the crest. It was not a grab or a strike. It laid its wet, long-fingered hand upon the edge of the marker stone, and the hum in Anselm's chest surged so hard it stole his breath. He felt something pass between them, a thread pulled taut in both directions. Images came in flashes, the black ribbon of the river curling through the valley, the standing stones half submerged in a flood, the still surface of a pool under moonlight, and beneath it, something vast and shapeless, watching without eyes. Anselm staggered, but Edric's hand held him steady. The figure withdrew its hand, but another took its place, then another, each touch sending another pulse through him. The hum became layered now, many tones at once, the ridge vibrating underfoot. "They're feeding from it," Garrett said, voice low. "Or it's feeding from them," the rider countered. The water had reached the base of the twisted trees. It spread around their roots without sound, curling inward toward the stone. The pale figures did not step onto the marker, but their presence thickened the air until it was hard to draw breath. Anselm felt his knees weaken. The hum was no longer contained to his chest. It filled his head, the rhythm syncing with his heartbeat until they were indistinguishable. His vision swam. For a moment, he thought he saw himself reflected in the dark water pooled at the marker's edge, but the reflection's eyes were black as the river. "Enough," Edric said, starting forward. But before he could pull Anselm away, the ground beneath the marker shifted. A low crack split the stone, running straight through the carved crest. The hum cut out so suddenly it left an aching silence. The pale figures froze, the water stilled, and then, as if a rope had been cut, they surged forward. "Back!" the rider shouted, grabbing Anselm's arm and pulling him from the stone's edge. The figures climbed faster now, water spilling from their limbs, their movements no longer measured but hungry. They retreated up the ridge, boots slipping on wet rock. The twisted trees gave way to bare stone again, sharper underfoot. Behind them, the pale shapes rose over the broken marker, their dark eyes fixed on the fleeing boy. When the ridge levelled out, the rider stopped abruptly and pointed ahead. Through the thinning mist, the outline of a stone archway emerged, standing alone at the crest. No wall joined it, no path led beyond it, just the arch, weathered and lichen-streaked, framing the open sky. Edric frowned. "What is it?" The rider's voice was steady but grim. "The last marker before the high pass. If it fails." She didn't finish. Anselm glanced back. The figures were still climbing, their pale forms stark against the dark water surging behind them. And somewhere deep within, he felt the hum begin again, not from the stone they had left, but from the arch ahead. The arch grew taller as they approached. Its stones fitted so closely that no moss had found purchase between them. Time had rounded the edges, but the shape remained perfect, a curve that seemed almost too precise for human hands. Through its hollow centre, the pale sky showed a faint shimmer, as if the air within was not quite the same as the air around it. Anselm slowed without meaning to. The hum inside him was stronger now, resonating in the hollow of his chest and the base of his skull. It was not the steady rhythm of the marker stones, but a layered chord that rose and fell like breath. Each step closer made it harder to tell where the sound ended and his own heartbeat began. The rider reached the arch first, her hand brushing the lowest stone. She drew back as though it had stung her. "It's awake," she said quietly. Garrett had caught up now, leaning heavily on his cane. His eyes lingered on the shimmer within the archway. "It's more than awake, it's remembering." Edric's jaw tightened. Remembering what? Garrett did not answer directly. This was the high gate before there were roads, not for people, for the river itself when it still ran here. Anselm stared at the empty air framed by the stone. "There's no river here now." "Not above," Garrett said. "Beneath." The hum surged once, so strong it made Anselm's knees soften. He took a half step toward the arch before Edric's hand closed on his shoulder. "Careful," his father warned. Below them, the pale figures had reached the broken marker. They did not slow to linger as they had before. Instead, they came on, climbing over the wet rock with the water at their heels. The dark ribbon behind them curled and shifted like something alive, its surface reflecting no light. "They're not slowing," Edric said. "They won't," the rider replied. "This is where they've been trying to lead him." Anselm's throat tightened. "Why me?" The rider's gaze was steady. "Because you carry what they need to pass through. You've been carrying it since before the stone was given to you. The bindings only made it stronger." The shimmer in the archway brightened, the air within it rippling like disturbed water. For an instant, Anselm thought he saw depth there, a dark channel beneath the surface, leading away into shadow. Garrett's voice was low. "Once the gate is open, there's no closing it from this side. If they pass through with him, the river will not only rise in the valley, it will rise everywhere it remembers." Edric shifted, his hammer gripped tight. "Then we stop them here." The rider shook her head. "Not with steel, not with stone. This gate doesn't answer to that." The hum inside Anselm flared again, almost painfully now. It was pulling him forward, step by step, until he stood less than a pace from the arch. The shimmer filled his vision, and in it he thought he saw shapes moving, long-limbed, pale, gliding through water that had no surface. One of them turned its head, and its eyes were his own. He stumbled back, gasping. The hum dimmed, but it did not vanish. The pale figures were almost at the crest now, their faces lifting toward the arch, unreadable yet intent. The dark water behind them spilled higher, licking at the stones of the path. The rider's voice was taut. "If you touch the gate, it will take you. If you don't, they'll drag you through." Edric stepped in front of his son. "Then what's left?" Garrett's eyes did not leave Anselm. "Only one thing. He can walk through on his own terms." The words hung heavy in the thin air. The first of the pale figures reached the crest, water streaming from its limbs onto the stone. It paused at the sight of the arch, then tilted its head toward Anselm in a slow, deliberate motion. The shimmer inside the gate deepened, and with it came a sound that was not quite the river's voice, but something older, vaster, as if the memory of all water had turned to listen. The sound from the arch was unlike anything Anselm had ever heard. It was not loud, yet it filled the space around him so completely that it seemed to replace the air itself. It had no single tone. It was a chorus of currents, the rush of distant floods, the stillness of deep pools, the faint trickle of unseen springs. Every drop of water he had ever touched or tasted felt present in that sound, as though it were calling its due. The pale figure nearest the crest stepped forward, its wet hand pressing against the stone base of the arch. The shimmer within rippled outward in concentric waves, and Anselm's hum answered without his consent. It was no longer a rhythm in his chest, it was in his blood, a slow turn pulling him toward the gate. Edric shifted to block his path, but the rider spoke quickly. "Don't touch him. If you break the pull, it will only return stronger. Let him hold it for now." "For now?" Edric's voice was low, dangerous. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the figures below as more of them crested the ridge, water pooling at their feet before slipping away into the cracks of the stone. None moved toward her or Edric or Garrett. They moved only toward Anselm. The air grew heavier, damp against the skin, as though the mist itself had thickened into breath. The hum inside him changed, folding into a pattern that felt almost like words. He could not understand them, yet they brushed the edges of memory, stirring images he could not place. Moonlight on a still lake, the echo of footsteps in water too shallow to hide them, the weight of a small carved stone in his hand long before he had ever received it. Garrett's voice cut through the haze. "Anselm, listen to me. If you step through on their terms, you'll be part of them. But if you walk through on your own, you may still choose what you become." The rider glanced at the old man sharply. "That's a risk. It's the only one left," he replied. Edric moved closer to his son, his voice firm but trembling. "You're not walking through anywhere. Not while I'm breathing." Anselm tore his gaze from the shimmer long enough to meet his father's eyes. "If I stay, they'll keep coming. You saw what happened in the valley. They won't stop. Not for me. Not for anyone." The figures had gathered now in a loose ring around the base of the arch, their pale forms lit faintly by the shimmer. They did not touch Anselm, but their stillness was worse than any motion could have been, like the poised calm before a net is drawn tight. The sound from the arch deepened again, and the shimmer shifted in colour, darkening toward the green of river depths. The air through it seemed to move, slow and heavy, pulling at the edges of Anselm's cloak. The rider stepped beside him. "If you go, remember this. Water keeps what it's given, but it also carries it onward. You can choose which it does with you." He nodded slowly, the weight in his chest almost unbearable now. Edric's hand gripped his arm one last time, fierce enough to leave marks. "You come back," he said. It was not a plea, but a command. Anselm stepped forward. The pale figures parted for him without sound or sign, their heads tilting in unison as he approached the arch. The shimmer filled his vision, and within it he saw the dark channel again, winding away into shadow. The hum in his blood rose to match it until there was nothing else. No stone under his feet, no wind on his face, only the endless pull. He crossed the threshold. The cold struck first, a deep, clean cold that went beyond the skin. Then the weightlessness, no ground, no sky, only the steady current carrying him forward. Shapes moved beside him, not touching, but close enough for him to feel their presence. Some were the pale forms from the ridge, others were less certain, shadows of things with no edges, too large to measure, too deep to see fully. Somewhere ahead, the channel widened, and a dim light spread through the water. It was not sunlight, but something older, steady and unchanging. The figures around him slowed, drifting aside, as though what lay ahead was meant for him alone. And in the stillness before he reached it, a voice spoke, clear now, without layers, without distance. "You carry more than the river's memory, Anselm. You carry its choice." The voice seemed to ripple through the water, not loud but impossible to ignore, each word sinking deep into him, as though they had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. Anselm slowed, letting the current bear him forward at its own pace. The pale figures lingered at a distance now, their shapes dimming in the shifting light, as if unwilling or unable to come closer to where he was being led. The channel's walls widened into something vast, a hollow space beneath the world. Its boundaries were difficult to see. They blurred into darkness, and yet he felt an immensity pressing outward in all directions, like standing in the center of a breath held for centuries. The floor beneath was not rock or silt, but a smooth black surface that reflected nothing, not even the faint light above. In the center of this space stood, or perhaps floated, an object. At first glance it looked like a stone, but as he neared, Anselm saw it was shaped more like a seed, dark and veined with thin lines of pale glow. It was large enough that he could not have wrapped his arms around it, yet it seemed lighter than the water it rested in. The glow within its veins pulsed slowly, in rhythm with the hum still alive in his blood. The voice came again, from nowhere and everywhere. "This is the first memory, the spring before all springs, the choice made before the river knew its own path." Anselm circled the seed, his fingertips brushing it. The moment he touched it, visions rose, images sharper and heavier than dreams. He saw the river in its earliest course, a silver thread winding through untouched valleys. He saw figures like the pale ones, but less shadowed, walking its banks in silence. And he saw himself, though not himself, standing where water met stone, placing something small and carved into the current and watching it sink. His breath caught. "That was me." The voice did not confirm, nor deny. "The river does not know time as you do. It knows only what it has kept." The seed's glow flared slightly beneath his hand. "They want this," he said. "They want what it offers," the voice replied. "It can carry them beyond the banks it remembers. It can carry you as well." Anselm's fingers tightened against the smooth surface. "And if I take it?" The current around him seemed to pause, as if waiting. "Then the river will follow you where you go. It will keep what you keep. It will take what you take." He thought of the valley, of the houses swallowed in mist and black water. He thought of Edric, of the rider, of Garrett's warning that some ties could only be followed to their end. He thought of the hum that had lived in him since the stone had touched his hand, and perhaps before. Far behind, he felt the presence of the pale forms, shifting restlessly. The current from which they had hung back was beginning to stir again, pushing him gently toward the seed. "Why me?" he asked, though the answer felt dangerously close. "Because you are not only of the river," the voice said. "You are of the land as well. You can walk where the water cannot, and the water will walk with you." The glow of the seed brightened, spilling pale light into the dark expanse. The hum in his blood matched it exactly now, each pulse locking into place until it felt less like something foreign and more like a truth returning. Anselm rested both hands on it. The surface was neither warm nor cold, but it felt alive, like holding a creature that did not breathe, yet was awake. The current pressed more firmly against his back, urging him forward. "You can return to the bank and leave this here," the voice said, its tone unchanged. "The river will continue as it always has, and it will take what it will take. Or you can carry it, and the river will follow the path you choose for it." The water around him darkened slightly, as though the pale figures were drawing nearer again. Their patience had limits. Anselm tightened his grip. "And if I choose wrong?" "The river keeps all choices," the voice replied. Above, the faint light began to fade, replaced by a slow swirl of shadow. The pale forms were no longer waiting. They were coming, silent and certain, their dark eyes fixed on him and the seed between his hands. The water thickened around him as the pale forms drew closer, their movements faster now, less like drifting and more like pursuit. The current pressed harder against his back, urging him toward the seed, as if the river itself had decided the moment could not wait. The glow beneath his fingers pulsed sharply, and with each beat he felt a tug, not on his body, but on the very core of him, as though the seed were pulling threads that had been tied long before he was born. He glanced over his shoulder. The figures had fanned out in a half-circle, their limbs bending with a fluid grace that made it impossible to tell where movement ended and stillness began. One of them raised a hand, and the water between them and Anselm darkened, ripples tightening like the drawn lines of a net. "You cannot hold it against the river's will," the voice warned. "If you carry it, you must do so in agreement, not in defiance." Anselm swallowed, his hands still locked on the seed. "Then I agree, to take it where they can't." The voice did not answer, but the glow flared once, bright enough to throw their shadows back. The pale forms hesitated, their dark eyes narrowing against the light. The current shifted sharply then, swirling around the seed in tight spirals that wrapped Anselm as well, pulling both of them upward. The ascent was sudden. The black floor of the chamber dropped away, the walls dissolving into a blur of moving water. The pale figures tried to follow, but the spirals became a barrier, the light within them deepening to the green of river depths before fading into something closer to silver. The pressure built in his chest and ears as they rose. The hum was deafening now, not from outside but within, his own blood singing in rhythm with the seed. For a moment he thought he would burst, then the current broke, and he was standing, breathless, on wet stone beneath an open sky. He staggered, blinking against the sudden brightness. The arch was before him again, but now the shimmer within it was gone, replaced by a faint haze that faded even as he watched. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of rain. Edric was there, eyes wide, one hand still half raised as if he had been reaching for Anselm the moment before. The rider stood to one side, dagger drawn, her gaze scanning the ridge behind them. Garrett, leaning on his cane, gave a single nod when he saw the seed cradled in Anselm's arms. "You brought it out," the old man said. Anselm could barely find his voice. "It wouldn't stay without me." Below, the mist was in turmoil. The pale forms moved within it, but their climbing had slowed. The water that had surged up the ridge was receding, slipping back toward the valley as though pulled by an unseen tide. Yet none of the figures turned away. Their dark eyes remained fixed on him, their stillness promising they would follow when they could. The rider stepped closer, her tone low but urgent. "You've bound yourself to it now. There's no hiding from them. Wherever you go, the river will know." Edric's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure it follows him where they can't." Anselm looked down at the seed. Its glow was dimmer here but steady, a faint pulse that matched his own heartbeat. It was lighter than it had felt in the depths, but he could still sense its weight in ways that had nothing to do with his arms. Garrett's eyes narrowed. "The high pass leads to waters they do not remember, springs older than their making. If he can bring it there, the choice will be his alone." The wind shifted then, carrying with it the faintest murmur, not words, but the same layered sound he had heard in the channel. It came from behind them, from the path that wound higher into the mountains. Anselm tightened his grip on the seed. For the first time, the hum in his chest felt not like a summons, but like a readiness. The rider glanced once more at the pale forms below before meeting his eyes. Then we go up. The path to the high pass was little more than a scar cut into the side of the mountain, narrow enough that at times they had to turn sideways to pass between the jagged outcroppings. Loose stones shifted underfoot, skittering down into the misty drop where the pale water waited far below. The air grew colder with each step, the wind sharper, carrying a thin metallic edge that made the tongue taste faintly of blood. Anselm carried the seed close against his chest, its dim glow casting pale light on the wet rock whenever the mist thickened. It was steady now, no longer pulsing wildly, but every so often it gave a faint tremor, as if sensing something ahead or something behind. He did not need to glance back to know the pale figures were still there. They moved in the valley's shadow, never climbing faster than the group, but never falling away. Edric kept close at his side, his hammer hanging heavy at his belt. He said little, but Anselm could feel the constant watch in his father's gaze, as though he meant to keep the boy tethered to the earth by will alone. The rider led them, her steps quick and precise, pausing only to glance at the dark slopes above. Garrett followed last, leaning on his cane but never slowing, his eyes fixed not on the path but on the pale light that came from the seed. By midday, the path narrowed into a ridge barely wider than 2 boot lengths. On the far side was a sheer cliff that dropped into nothing but cloud. On the near side, a wall of black stone streaked with veins of white quartz. The wind here was constant, hissing through the cracks and hollows with a voice that almost sounded like the river below. They moved single file, the rider first. Halfway across, the wind shifted, and Anselm heard it clearly. A voice in the hiss, soft and layered, speaking not in words but in the cadence of water curling around stone. The seed gave a faint answering hum in his arms. "They're trying to call it back," Garrett said from behind him. His voice carried thin in the wind. "And if it answers, it will take you with it." "I'm not letting it go," Anselm replied, though his grip had already tightened. The ridge ended at a hollow in the mountain wall, a place where the rock folded inward, sheltering a small pool of perfectly still water. It was no wider than a cart's wheel, no deeper than the length of a hand, but its surface reflected the grey sky with unnatural clarity. Even when the wind tore at their cloaks, the water did not stir. "This is one of the remembering springs," Garrett said, leaning heavily on his cane. "Older than the river in the valley, older than the pale ones. If the seed is placed here, it will take its memory from the moving water and give it to the still." The rider crouched beside the pool, her gaze sharp. "They won't let us do it without a fight." As if her words had been a signal, a shadow moved in the mist below. One by one, the pale figures began to climb, their long limbs folding and reaching in ways no human could match. The water in the valley did not follow them this time. It stayed low, as though holding its strength for another purpose. Edric stepped forward, hammer in hand. "Then we hold them here." Anselm knelt by the pool, the seed resting on his knees. Its glow reflected in the still water, the lines of pale light seeming to stretch downward into depths far greater than the pool's size should allow. The hum returned, not loud, but deep enough to settle in his bones. From the ridge path, the first pale figure appeared, its black eyes fixed not on him, but on the seed. The others followed, their movements silent but urgent now. The air thickened with the scent of cold stone and deep water. The rider drew her dagger and moved to the narrow mouth of the ridge. Edric joined her, their figures blocking the way forward. Garrett stayed close to Anselm, his cane planted firmly in the stone. "They'll try to break your focus," the old man warned. "Don't listen, not even if the voice is your own." Anselm lowered the seed toward the still water. For a heartbeat, the hum aligned perfectly with the silence of the spring. Then the first pale hand reached for the rider's cloak. Steel flashed, water hissed against the blade, and the fight began. The clash at the ridge mouth was unlike any battle Anselm had seen or imagined. The pale figures did not strike with the force of men, but with the inevitability of water, slipping past steel, bending around stone, returning again and again no matter how many times they were driven back. The rider's dagger flashed in tight arcs, each strike turning a grasping hand into a spray of mist that reformed moments later. Edric's hammer came down in blows that cracked the stone underfoot, forcing the creatures back through sheer weight, even if they could not be broken entirely. Behind them, Garrett stood still, his cane braced in both hands, eyes never leaving Anselm. "Do it now," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Once it begins, nothing must interrupt you." Anselm lowered the seed toward the still water. Its glow brightened with each inch, spilling across the surface until the pool looked as though it had swallowed the sky. The hum in his chest deepened into a single sustained note that seemed to pull the air inward. The moment the seed touched the water, the note broke into a rush of sound, not from above, but from within the spring itself. Images struck him like flashes of lightning. Rivers winding across lands he did not know, storms breaking over mountains, floodwaters swallowing forests, then receding to leave new valleys behind. He felt not only the river's memory, but its desire to move, to change, to shape the world and be shaped by it. The pale figures sensed it too. They lunged as one, their forms twisting to slip past Edric and the rider. One nearly reached him, its hand brushing the edge of the seed before Garrett's cane struck down with surprising force, the sound ringing like iron. The creature recoiled, its form scattering into vapor that trailed away on the wind. The water in the pool began to change. It no longer reflected the sky. It reflected motion, currents spinning deep below the surface where no light reached. The seed's veins blazed with silver light, and the hum inside Anselm became a wordless call, as though the spring itself was asking him for the final act. He understood without being told. Pressing the seed fully beneath the surface, he let go. The still water rippled once. Then the light within the seed burst outward in a slow expanding wave that moved through stone, air and mist alike. The ridge shook underfoot, and the pale figures froze, their black eyes wide. One by one they began to dissolve, not into vapor, but into threads of water that flowed back down the slope, pulled irresistibly toward the valley far below. The wind shifted, carrying away the heavy scent of deep water. The hum faded from Anselm's chest, leaving behind only the echo of its rhythm, like a heartbeat remembered in silence. The spring was calm again, its surface once more reflecting the dim sky, the seed gone from sight. The rider lowered her dagger, breathing hard. Edric stepped to Anselm's side, his hand firm on the boy's shoulder. "It's done?" Garrett's gaze lingered on the pool. "For now. The spring will hold what it's been given, but the river never forgets entirely. One day it may come looking again." Anselm looked down into the water. His reflection was there, but something in the eyes was different, darker at the edges, deeper. He knew then that whatever had been tied between him and the river was not truly gone. The spring had taken the seed, but some part of it had remained with him. The ridge was quiet now. The mist in the valley had thinned, revealing faint glimpses of roofs and fields below. No pale shapes moved in the water. The air smelled only of rain and stone. The rider stepped past him, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "You chose where the river would keep its memory. That will matter." Edric looked toward the high pass, where the path curved out of sight. "Then let's leave this place before it changes its mind." They turned from the spring, their steps carrying them upward toward the pass. The wind was cold, but clean. For the first time since the rider had appeared in Clywarden, Anselm felt the pull in his chest ease, though it never faded entirely. It was no longer a summons, it was a reminder. Behind them, the still water lay unbroken, holding both the river's first memory and the choice he had made. Far below, the valley waited, its rivers winding quiet and dark, as if listening.